Well, this is really kind of a fun afternoon, and in some ways, so many people that I've known a long time show up, including my old comrade from reenacting days. So let's talk about, I got myself into a real fix when my publisher, Ted Savis at Savis Beatty, came up with the bright idea of doing a Fog of War book. Fog of War, what the heck is that, right? And he said, well, we'll have two authors, one write the Union side and one write the Confederate side, and we'll publish it in one book. I said, okay, because I didn't know anything about this, and so he said I should write about the Union side, the Iron Brigade, and its first battle, and he would have somebody, a guy named Bill Backus actually, write about the Confederate side. I said, well, I don't want to write about the Confederates. And so we ended up coming into this strange book, and I quickly figured out I knew too much about the Iron Brigade, because my Fog of War was not very foggy. So it made it difficult. Trying to judge the decisions made by officers on the field and try to put myself in their place and what they knew and didn't know about a situation. The Prussian military analyst Karl von Clausewitz used the word fog in describing the uncertainty facing military officers on the field of battle. Were they confident of their own ability? What did they know about the ability of the foe? What about their officers? Did they trust their officers? Did they trust themselves? What are the weather possibilities? All these decisions have to, when you face a combat situation, you have to think about those. So those are all things I had to weigh as I went through the material. Writing about the Iron Brigade, of course, everybody knows about the Iron Brigade, and if they don't, there's books that you can purchase for modest fees to get it. And it's so easy, when you write a book about, I wrote a couple, a series of books, and one of them was on the Battle of Gettysburg, and you find this, it's easy for me to sit there and make these judgment calls on officers. Well, he made the right decision. This guy didn't make the bad decision. So you have to work all of that in. So you have to put yourself in the place of that, and that was very difficult in some cases, considering the role of the Iron Brigade, or what was not the Iron Brigade at the time, and how they fought their first battle at Gainesville on a field now called Brawner's Farm. There's even confusion about the name of the battle. Confederates called it Groveton for a small nearby thing, and the Union guys, the Iron Brigade guys, called it Gainesville for another small town nearby. And the word Brawner Farm, which is the most popular name for the name now, was first used in 1961 by Alan Nolan in his powerful book, The Iron Brigade, A Military History. In saying this, I was reminded of a day in August of 1981 when I was on hand when the Veterans Museum would now hold all the flags of the federal regiments, began to unroll them for the first time in almost a century. The flags had been rolled and covered with gauze and stored, and now they were ready to do a restoration of those flags, right? And so they had to literally, we had two big tables, and they roll the flags out, and they were all Iron Brigade flags, the ones that they did today. They were in tatters. They were, a lot of the flags were painted, and the paint chipped off and took the silk with it. So when you opened it up, you had a handful of chips, that had to be ultimately put back in place by the restorer. The flag smelled of dust and smoke, even then. And then the staffs that the flags are on, shot to pieces, held together by wire to hold because the staffs had been hit. Can you imagine carrying around the flag? I mean, they were hit 8, 9 times. One flag was a tree sapling. The staff was the flag staff. And what had happened is the 7th Wisconsin flag bearer had hit by canister in the battle and shattered the staff. And that night of the July 1st, 1863, they cut down a small tree and made this new flagstaff, and that's still there today. They wouldn't give it to me. I said, it's just an old piece of tree, you know, and they said, no. They said, I can't. What's with those people? So, what reminded me of this was on all of the battle flags, they have battle honors painted on of where they were at different places. And the story of Brawner's Farm, or their first battle, was always Gainesville. Gainesville was a small town. So I refused to use Brawner's Farm. No, I'm just teasing. I think Brawner's Farm, the battle was fought on the field rented by John Brawner. But nobody knew that at the time of the battle, right? You just, you fought on a field, and so they named it after the closest town. And that was Gainesville. And the flags all carried the battle honors of the Iron Brigade flag, said Gainesville. So what happened? If I could figure out how to make this machine work, So it was their baptisms of blood. The brigade was a Western Brigade made up of the 2nd, 6th, 7th Wisconsin, and 19th Indiana, the only infantry brigade from the past, in the Army of the Potomac area. The brigade had spent 4 months at Fredericksburg nearby, where they were trained, and they were held in reserve while McClellan attacked Richmond. And the plan was that they would, if needed, they would rush over land and hit the Confederates in the flank, and the battle would be won. The photo on this that I'm showing up here was in a book by Charles King called The Iron Brigade. Charles King was the son of Rufus King, who was the division commander and the first commander of the Iron Brigade. So we have this is a great image by Mike Thorson of the fighting. So what happens is that Stonewall Jackson and a Confederate division make their way into central Virginia. And to find them, the Union Army is being hustled here, there, and everywhere. So the Western Brigade, our people, were marching along the Warrenton Turnpike at the end of a long day trying to find the Confederates. And the Confederates shelled the column a couple of times during the day, mainly horse artillery, Confederate horse artillery, to slow the column down. And they were on their way to a rendezvous point at Manassas Junction, which was not far away. Suddenly, as they're walking along the roadway, a Confederate horse battery starts shooting at them again. And so the column they stop, and they're on the Brawner Farm field. And this is John Gibbon's Western Brigade, a great picture of a great picture of a 6th Wisconsin soldier. Anyway, and they began to shell the column. And so they halt, and there's trees, and then the Confederates are firing about 500 yards away from a ridgeline onto the road. Runs parallel to the road. So John Gibbon, an old artillery officer himself, gets the bright idea of sneaking a regiment up through the woods and grab that battery. Man, I want to grab that battery, right? A Confederate battery. He being an old artilleryman, he was the commander of Battery B of the 4th U.S., which is also involved in the fighting. So he confers with Abner Doubleday, whose division is also close by and hiding, and they agree to send a regiment up. And so they send the 2nd Wisconsin through the woods, and they come out in the field, and they're marching along, and all of a sudden, Confederates, more Confederates than they've ever seen in one place, show up, coming over. So the 2nd Wisconsin instantly engaged against at least 5 Confederate regiments at the time. And this is their first battle. The 2nd Wisconsin had been in the Battle of Bull Run and had run with everybody else, but that's another story. And so Gibbon suddenly realizes that there's Confederate infantry. And it dawns on him that it might be this division of Stonewall Jackson running around in central Virginia. So he immediately sends up the 19th Indiana on the left, and he sends up the 7th Wisconsin onto the right of the 2nd, so you have 3 regiments fighting, and then he sends the 6th, and 6th goes up on the extreme left. There's John Gibbon, what a guy, right? And this is the 2nd Wisconsin at Fredericksburg, and a very rare picture of the color guard of the 2nd Wisconsin, another 2nd Wisconsin picture. And then you have the 7th Wisconsin. All these photographs were taken in that 4-month period that they were at Fredericksburg. Apparently somebody came down and took a ton of they took every company of the 4 regiments and took pictures of them. And there's only about 3 or 4 that we can identify today. If you look in the background of this picture, that's actually Fredericksburg in the distance. This is the John Brawner farmhouse, which is a recreation of the original farm. It's now a place where there's a walking path. You can take Brawner's farm all the way in. And that's the field that they began to cross. And this probably explains a little better what had happened. You see the wood line where it says Gibbon? There's a wood line, so he sends the 2nd up through that wood line in an attempt to capture the battery. And suddenly, they're hit by this massive Confederate force, and the battle swirls out of the thing. The 19th goes on, 7th goes in, the 6th goes in, and late in the day there's this big gap, and they send in the 76th New York and the 56th Pennsylvania from Doubleday, who was also in the woods with and they still don't know what they're actually fighting about. Battery B, which is of the 4th U.S., is also, you can see joined the firing, and they're supported by the 95th New York, also from Doubleday. So they began this fight, and it's dusk, and it lasts 90 minutes until it's so dark that they can't shoot. The Wisconsin and Indiana boys are a fresh brigade. They have no sense of, they can't retreat, right? Because this is their first time in battle after almost a year in service. How do you explain it to the folks back home that you never fired a shot against the rebels if you went back? So the battle was fought. It got too dark. The brigade fell back to the roadway and followed their orders to march on to Manassas Junction, which was a mistake, which I'll talk about later. So in the immediate hours after Gainesville, right, regimental officers and soldiers of Gibbon's Western Brigade took stock of what they had done. Gone finally was the lingering doubt how they would perform in combat. They had stood fire in a murderous exchange of musketry for an hour or more, and it proved that the long days on a drill field, they discovered, gave them the ability to maneuver and deliver a sustained firepower that broke apart Confederate attack regiments. Also recognized by the 2nd Wisconsin, which had been in a battle, and this was their 2nd major fight, was that the other regiments of the brigade could be counted on in a tight place. What happened is, when I began to look at the brigade before their first battle, they're in disarray. All of the brigade totally hates John Gibbon. He's a regular Army officer, now in charge of volunteers, and he sets up all these vigorous drills and teaching schools and all of that. And he makes them wear white leggings, which they don't want to wear, and orders all that. And that's a whole story in itself. But if you look at their regiments, the 2nd was kind of in disarray at that time. They had a new commander, Edward O'Connor, and who had been was in the course of taking over O'Connor, and I don't think if I have a. Oh, this is a great interesting. This is Rufus Dawes' drawing of the battle in his journal, and I won't get into all of that again. So then this is the fence where the 19th Indiana stood, and of course the first regiment we'll talk about, Sal Meredith, 19th Indiana. Sal Meredith didn't know much about being a soldier, but he sure knew a lot about politics, and he got himself commissioned a colonel of the regiment. He was 6'7", and one of the Wisconsin boys said he was kind of dangerous because he was so tall that he might get hit by the bullets flying over the regiment. He was in the Indiana Party in the Wigwam in the 1860s Republican Convention in Chicago that nominated Abraham Lincoln. So he's a choice target. Lysander Cutler of the 6th Wisconsin came from New England and had a big business that he lost in the Panic of 1856. He was too old to be a colonel, but he became so excited that he helped organize regiments, and as a result of it, Alexander Hamilton, Randall of the governor's office, who was governor at the time, made him a colonel of the 6th Wisconsin. Another interesting figure, William Robinson of the 7th Wisconsin, the colonel of the 7th, actually came from Minnesota. Had seen some service in the Mexican War, was highly respected and expected to be a good officer. And here's Edgar O'Connor. I don't have a good picture of him, but I'll show you one better, of the 2nd Wisconsin. So the 2nd Wisconsin is disarray, new commander shaping up. The 6th Wisconsin had more officers resign and replaced in that period before the Civil War. They were completely disorganized, not really well functioning. The 7th Wisconsin was a new regiment and hadn't been tested, and with a commander they weren't sure of. So the 4 regiments were really not in cohesiveness. And they hated not only Gibbon, but they hated each other because they wanted to be the choice regiment of the brigade. And they had, the 2nd Wisconsin, they had all these nicknames. The 2nd Wisconsin was called the ragged ass 2nd because at the Battle of Bull Run they were wearing their gray militia uniforms yet. And they said, one soldier said, watching the 2nd on parade is like watching a regiment of Highlanders minus their kilts. So they had, the 2nd was not in good shape. The 6th, they called the Calico 6th sometimes because they had a lot of farm kids in the regiment that came to Camp Randall wearing homemade shirts out of calico, so they called them the Calicos. 7th Wisconsin was known as the Hungry 7th because they were always talking about pies. And they were also known as the Huckleberry 7th because they liked huckleberry pie. And of course, the 19th Indiana, boy, I can't even say bad things about the 19th Indiana. Rascally guys, called the Swamp Hogs. And they had a 19 on their hats, and Phil told the story earlier. And when they were at Fredericksburg, nothing tastes better than a stolen chicken, right? You get into a chicken coop and you can grab that chicken, and one guy said, we burnt chicken to our heart's content. So the 19th Indiana, take the 1 off and turn their 9 around so it looked like a 6. So when the farmer came out yelling, all he saw was the 6th Regiment. So the 6th Regiment got a blame for all of the chickens stolen around Fredericksburg because of that. Can you imagine what a rascally outfit that was? So they go into their first battle. They're really not well organized. They hate each other. Regiments, the little clannish type thing. Gibbon is not, a new commander. They don't like him because he's a regular. They're not sure of their own commander, their colonels. They don't have a clue whether those colonels are going to be work out. They don't know how they're going to perform, right? And so they're really not the regiment, not the Iron Brigade that we remember. They were disorganized. They were unsure of themselves. They had spent months drilling, and had never seen action except for the second, and the second lorded it over everybody else, you know. Well, we were at Bull Run and you guys weren't even here. You could hear that, right? And so they hated the second. Second was always playing pranks on the 6th Wisconsin. And why would they do that? 6th Regiment was a great regiment, one of my favorite regiments. Anyway, so they went into this battle really unorganized, and it really formed them in many ways into a fighting organization. The losses were absolutely numbing. This picture on the far right is Edgar O'Connor and the staff. The one officer seated in the middle is Lucius Fairchild. This is also taken at Fredericksburg. You can see the flag of the 2nd Wisconsin Drapier. That doggone photographer, I wish if you run across any of those pictures, let me know, okay? Because I'm sure there's dozens of officers pictures. So you got what happened in the fighting. Edgar O'Connor of the 2nd Wisconsin was killed. He was hit, they said he was hit 5 times and shot to pieces. Colonel Robinson of the 7th was wounded. Cutler of the 6th was shot in the leg. Solomon Meredith of the 19th Indiana was wounded. Well, kind of his horse fell on him because he was so big. He had a big, you know, it was hard for him to find a horse to hold him. Isaac May of the 19th Indiana was killed. He was left on the battlefield in a rainstorm when they marched away to go to Manassas Junction, which I'll talk about later. Nobody's ever found his grave. Edgar O'Connor's father, Edgar O'Connor was very prominent in Wisconsin, and his father sent a special detail out to find his body on the battlefield where he was buried on the battlefield at Brawner's Farm. And they had a map showing supposedly where everybody was killed, and they couldn't find him at first. They kept digging up graves, and finally they said that one guy said they dug up a grave and there was a blanket, and they lifted the blanket and they saw the colonel's bars on his shoulder. So they brought him in. He's buried in Washington. Charles Hamilton of the 7th Wisconsin, shot 4 or 5 times. At the end of the battle, he's mounted. He's shot 4 or 5 times, wounded badly in the leg. He's bleeding. He falls off his horse in a faint at the end of the battle. He collapses. And Hamilton, doesn't that sound familiar? He's the grandson of Alexander Hamilton from our days in the past. He comes back and is very prominent. He never is able to recover and come back because his injuries are so severe. So what had happened really is that the 2nd Wisconsin suddenly had proved that they were good fighters because, you know, they had been bragging about it all the time. And the 6th and 7th and the 19th Indiana suddenly proved that they were worthy of the brigade, and they were they were accepted for the first time by everybody. In other words, they began to respect each other. But that's all new. When they went into the battle, it took that ferocious combat to do it. John Gibbon hated going into the battle. I mean, I could tell you 17 stories about John Gibbon. He was a North Carolinian. He was raised. He had three relatives in the Confederate Army, and he stayed with the Union. He's a West Point graduate. He was commander of Battery B, and when he replaced Rufus King as the brigade commander of the Western Brigade, he always rode small horses, and he was very long-legged. And they said the soldiers laughed at him. They called him the Southern Renegade because, you know, most of his people had gone south. John Gibbon was he loaded his guys up with material and they threw it away. And, you know, a West Pointer couldn't stand seeing all that stuff. On their first march, they threw all their blankets and coats away. So he's distant, so he's a figure, but he wins their hearts at the Battle of Gainesville. In the heaviest of the fighting, he's there. Ties his horse to a tree behind the 19th Indiana, dismounts, trying to get them into the battle. The horse runs away, and he has to be taken, walk for the field. But what most important is his heavy season of drills and schools of instruction had turned the brigade into something that was, they could march under fire because they had done it so often. They found that they could stand and shoot because they had practiced loading in 9 times over and over and over. And so funnily, they realized that they had this ability that they didn't recognize before. You know, when they got into combat, you're supposed to be able to fire 3 rounds a minute with a Civil War musket, and they did it over and over. When the Confederates attacked them, the first time they got into a fight, the 2nd Wisconsin is up there facing 5 regiments which became the Stonewall Brigade. 5 regiments against 1 regiment. And what happened? Those Wisconsin boys were able to shoot and be so organized that training, they did it instinctively, and they were able to knock down those Confederate regiments and bust them up faster than the Confederates couldn't do it, couldn't take them over. So somehow, Gibbon had turned them into a real fighting brigade. And the moment that he really became endeared to the brigade was when he was listening to the verbal reports of the frightful loss of his regiments, and he dropped his head and wept most bitterly. Suddenly, John Gibbon became somebody of a figure of importance. So you have to think about this, and what I've figured out in all this when writing about these things, you had to understand that the brigade was not anything like we like to read about later. The brigade was fragile, it was disorganized, it had a commander they hated, and Gainesville changed it all. For 90 minutes of fighting, they suddenly realized that they were really able to function. A lot of the fighting was at ranges of 100 yards. It's not far with a Civil War musket. Sometimes it was 70 yards, and sometimes it was 30 yards. But they stood there and fired at each other until it was so dark that they couldn't see. Think about that. You know, do you have the courage to do that? The losses are horrible. 1/3 of the brigade, 725, were casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. 2nd Wisconsin lost 278 of 430 carried into the field. Think about the losses on that. Napoleon said if a regiment lost 10% of its men, it was no longer functionable. Well, they didn't. The 6th Wisconsin was kind of out of the fighting, had 8 killed, 61 wounded, 3 missing, of 504 engaged. The 7th Wisconsin had 164 casualties of 580 men engaged. You can see these are big regiments. Later, the regiments were down to 300. The battles after this, they just got knocked to pieces. 19th Indiana, 210 of 423 engaged. The 56th Pennsylvania, which came up to fill in the holes, lost 136 out of 300 engaged. 76 New York, 100 out of 250 engaged. 8 of the brigade's 12 field officers were injured, wounded, or killed. Think of that. They only had 4 field officers left at the end of that fighting. It forever marked them. These farm kids and piney workers from Wisconsin, it forever changed them, the way they thought about themselves and about battle. After the battle, a hired man said he could hardly recognize his tent mates because they were so dirty and literally marked by the battle itself. An officer looked at the faces of his men, and he looked at the lines that weren't there the day before. And he said he wanted to hug their necks. Hug their necks. After the fighting at Brawner's Farm, or Gainesville, Gibbon's brigade was involved in the fighting for 2 days at the fighting of Second Bull Run near Manassas Junction. They then went on to fight at South Mountain and again at Antietam, and of course, no sooner they were, their name had changed because Gibbon had given them those tall black hats like you see in the photos. And they were no longer Gibbon's Brigade or the Black Hat Brigade, but or the Western Brigade. They began to be known as the Black Hawk Brigade, and later, of course, the Iron Brigade. And we could have a long discussion about how that name occurred, but I know I'm right and everybody else is right. What had happened is, I'll tell you briefly, because this is a lecture all by itself, right? What had happened is McClellan at the Battle of South Mountain had built a big platform that he could watch the fighting as they advanced, trying to capture the gaps on South Mountain. And of course, the Iron Brigade was in the open, and now they're fighting pretty well because they realized they're good at it. And so they went up the hill, and McClellan claimed later, after the war, that he referred to them as men of iron and praised Gibbon's brigade marching up the hill. The soldiers at that time had no idea where the name came from. There's about 8 different sources. Dawes says he doesn't know where it came from. Gibbon says he doesn't know where it came from. And what happened was, and this is the true story. Well, pay attention, David. This is the true story. What had happened is a reporter was in that tower listening to the exchange, and he apparently heard the words iron. And on the 22nd of September, shortly after the battle, in his column in the Cincinnati Advertiser, he said the brigade had been under heavy fire, and the second especially. He said that they have been rightly called the Iron Brigade of the West. A newspaper reporter scores again, right? Makes it all right. You got to kind of, when I heard this story, there's the reference to the soldiers carrying around a piece of newspaper clipping and with the story of the Iron Brigade right after the battle. So I'm at Marquette and I'm teaching a class in Civil War history, and I got all these bright, shining faces looking at me. I send them all out on a search to read the microfilms of all the newspapers in the air. And guess what? They found the quote. And so that's the true story. He said that, the reporter wrote, "The last terrible battle has reduced this brigade to a mere skeleton, there being scarcely enough members to form half a regiment. The 2nd Wisconsin, which but a few weeks before numbered over 900 men, can now muster but 59. 59. Can you imagine the losses they had in the 4 battles that they fought in? And he says the brigade has done some of the hardest and best fighting in the service, and has been justly termed the Iron Brigade of the West." So now you know the real story. A newspaper guy, a reporter. I used to be a reporter, that's why I enjoy this story. I never wrote it. I never got a chance to name a brigade or anything. I've been called a lot of names, but that's another story. So when you write about this, you're trying to write about this, there were all sorts of missed opportunities. Why in God's name would John Gibbon and Abner Doubleday decide to try to capture that regiment, not knowing that Stonewall Jackson's whole division was just over the hill? And so you get there and you think, that's a mistake in some ways, right? He thought he would get a little glory, capture 4 cannons or something, and everybody be happy. He sends the 2nd in, the frickin' 2nd Wisconsin. It's his senior regiment because it had been at Bull Run. So he sends the one when the 2nd got up. The men in the 6th said, "Oh, that damn 2nd's going in ahead of us," because they were jealous of it. They wanted to be under fire. So he shouldn't have done that. And the advance of his interest just stirred up Stonewall Jackson to the point that Jackson came over the hill and went after him. And Jackson could have wiped him out. But he didn't, because he didn't engage his forces. He kept sending 4 or 5 regiments out, and the damn Wisconsin, Indiana boys just shot them to pieces. That load and 9 count, day after day on that drill field. They shot without thinking. They were able to maneuver. They back, forward, sideways. So they fought this great battle. The fog of war actually lifted for a brief time when it revealed that the 6th Wisconsin, which is way out on the right, had this huge gap of 2 regiments before the rest of the brigade was fighting off on the left. And suddenly they realized, because they could see the musket fire, that there was this big hole in the middle of their line. So they send in the 2 regiments and plug it up. Another division was not far away, less than a mile away, and the commander, Messina Patrick, said he was mad at Gibbon for going out. He said, "Gibbon started a fight." He said, "I'm not going out there. My brigade, or my division," he had actually, or I'm sorry, he had a brigade, and he made a mistake because he should have joined in. Right? The trick was they could have got Jackson and held him there for a brief period of time, and they would have got to him before the rest of the Confederate Army is moving up, ready to join Jackson and fight the great 2nd Battle of Bull Run. The decision that night, the brigade pulled back to the Warrenton Turnpike by the woods area, and the decision was, at that point, well, what are we supposed to do now? We stirred up all these Confederates, and somebody said, well, our orders are to march to Manassas Junction, and we better follow orders. So they march away from the battlefield, allowing Jackson to move around, allowing the Confederate reinforcements there. They march away from the battlefield, and they blame it on, it's blamed on John Gibbon, who in the meeting of the officers told them, well, we should follow orders. We got orders to march them, to Manassas Junction, and they did. And Rufus King, who was the division commander, he's the Milwaukee newspaper man, by the way. Again, one of my all-time favorites, a fine soldier. He had suffered an epileptic seizure about 2 days before, and he was just not engaged during the whole first part of that battle. The soldiers thought he was drunk, because they saw him leaning sitting next to a fence post on their way to the field. They thought he was drunk. So he was blamed for the decision of leaving the battlefield. Again, if he had stayed and engaged them, these other brigades could have joined in. Pope would have sent, John Pope, who was commander of the army at that point, thought that the Confederates were, trapped, and he could have won the battle by hitting him early. But of course, it all falls apart when they march away. Gibbon wrote later, after being challenged by Rufus King's son, said, "I do not hesitate today, and it is susceptible of proof, that of the 2 courses which I considered open to you, obeying the orders to march on to Centerville or Manassas Junction." So he made another mistake there. The 90 minutes of fighting also had problems finding a name, right? It's often At first, it was always lumped into the Battle of Second Bull Run, as that was part of which was occurred the next 2 days. But it was really a distinct and separate action, the first real fight of the baptisms of the blood of that Western Brigade, called the Iron Brigade of the West. As I said, they called the fight Gainesville for a small crossroads nearby, and that was the name painted on their battle flags. Manassas National Park Service did not inquire of the site until 1985, and after a time settled on the phrase Brawner's Farm, a name first given to him by Alan Nolan in 1961. The Park Service also improved the site. If you go there today, they have walking trails and markers, and you can actually walk around. I think the marker of the 6th Wisconsin is wrong, but that'll get me in a lot of trouble with the Park Service. And the reason that I think it happened is because the 6th Wisconsin talked about falling back through a runoff of water. And if you go there today, you can still see that runoff area of water. And they said they stumbled into that runoff, and the runoff today is probably 50 yards from the right side of the markers where the 6th Wisconsin would be. But that's, you deal with bureaucracy. They don't listen to reason. Why is it when you're from Wisconsin, everybody thinks you don't know what you're talking about? I mean, seriously. It's another whole story. A long time afterwards, Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin, in writing his history of the battle of his regiment, left a bitter summary of Brawner's Farm or Gainesville. He said, "On the afternoon of this day, August 28th, 1862, the best blood of Wisconsin and Indiana was poured out like water, and it was spilled for naught. One night's experience at Gainesville had eradicated our yearning for a fight. In our future history, we would always be ready, but never again anxious." Thank you.